We now shift and look at some of the economic, social, and demographic changes in the 18th century colonies, all of which show and are leading us in the direction of increased prosperity and opportunity. And at the bottom of the PowerPoint slide, you see what material culture can tell us. And in the picture, drawing of the 18th century, you see all kinds of stuff on the table and in the room. So material culture just means stuff. So you see table and chairs and different drinking vessels and goblets and candlesticks and other things. And material culture then remaining from the 17th and 18th century, attics and homes that go way back in time that still exist, indicate that the standard of living was improving. This can be known since we can date and know if a piece of furniture, for instance, or a piece of silverware was from the 17th or 18th century, and it came from the same attic and the same home, ostensibly from the same family. What historians can do is then say, okay, what seems to be happening in this colony or this city or that colony over time is that this family seemed to be getting wealthier. Their standard of living seemed to be improving. So say in one generation, the family had a certain type of tableware and utensils to eat with, but then 3 generations later, the family's able to afford a very expensive silverware set, expensive china, and these kind of things. So material culture, what we have remaining from the 17th and 18th century, shows that by the middle of the 18th century, that material culture was improving considerably, and that the overall evidence for the 18th century colonies, up and down, north to middle to south colonies, that prosperity certainly was on the rise. So in general, the colonies were quite prosperous, and even, as we'll see, relative to Europe, England, France, and other countries. In this slide, we can see the beginnings, and this slide that follows, the beginnings of westward expansion. And I'm sure you already know that much of the rest of this class will be about westward expansion. So there are a number of themes that are continuous: relations with Native Americans, slavery, and here's another one, westward expansion. We haven't talked about it yet, but of course we will in the future in further units. We can see from this map that westward expansion is just kind of beginning. The purple area, the westward expanse of expansion at this point, if you will, is just in and across the Appalachian Mountains, maybe just into what's known as the Ohio Valley. But we are seeing a trend, and the trend, of course, will continue. This slide, or this graph, shows us that the colonies were already becoming quite diverse, ethnically and culturally. And this doesn't include slaves, the graph. So when we account for slaves as well, coming from many different parts of Africa, then we see that there's even much greater diversity. But on the graph slide, we see about 35,000 immigrants coming from Germany in the first 75 years of the 18th century, about 70,000, twice as many, coming from Ireland and Scotland, and a lot of other people maybe not living in the colonies, but especially in the 3 big cities, New York, Philadelphia, and Boston. You could have walked, say, down the streets of lower Manhattan or through Boston in 2 hours, probably heard 8 different languages, because there were plenty of people there for trade. So you might hear Portuguese as people that were working on a ship that had just docked to unload wine from Portugal or in town for 2 or 3 days, and you hear them speaking Portuguese. So the colonies were already becoming much more diverse than we might realize. It wasn't just the English that were there. The Germans, who became affectionately known as the Pennsylvania Dutch. Why Dutch? There's a number of reasons, but part of it was because the English couldn't pronounce the word Deutsch, which is the German word for German, and so they've become known as the Pennsylvania Dutch ever since, even though they were Germans. And that does lead us back to the Dutch themselves, because remember that New York was originally a Dutch colony, and the Dutch didn't leave, weren't forced out. Some of them did, but they weren't forced out of the colony. So there's still a Dutch presence in the colonies, at least in New York, in the 18th century. So there's quite a bit of diversity already, and of course more to follow in U.S. history. These next two slides, that one's just your basic pie chart, and what lecture would be complete without a pie chart? Joke. But this one, I think, is better to make the point. You don't need to remember the specifics at all. This is just to give you a sort of graphic way to remember that not only was trade going on, but massive trade was already going on by the middle of the 18th century. That the colonies were exporting goods across the Atlantic to Europe, to Africa, to South America, to the Caribbean, and many different types of products being sent. Again, you don't remember what came from where, but just to know that it was on a large scale. This is part of what we identified when talking about the rise of Virginia as one colony to prosperity, the Atlantic system, or the triangular trade, which is another way to say that the colonists, and you can see it here in this chart, are right in the center of the world economy, which was the Atlantic Ocean. So they're not just the Virginians, but all the colonies now are in a central location. A recent study by a couple of economists, not historians, but doing an historical study, they went back, just came out a few years ago, and looked at the economic data from the 18th century colonies, and it's incomplete. They didn't keep economic records in those days like we do today, didn't have the technology as well. But to the best extent possible, the greatest extent possible, they were able to compile statistics, and I think are roughly accurate in their conclusions. And the conclusions they drew were basically consistent with what historians have thought for a long time about increasing prosperity from the 17th to the 18th century in the colonies. Historians have known this, or believed they were correct in their conclusions, mainly from written evidence. Remember, historians primarily look at primary source documents as the lion's share of evidence in historical study, and looking at diaries and letters, usually from visitors coming from Europe, from England, France, Spain, to the colonies, and writing home, writing their diaries. You see again and again in these primary sources people just being bowled over, being astonished by how successful, prosperous, wealthy the colonists and the colonies were. You just see it time and time again. Well, this recent book by economists looks at economic evidence, looks at numbers and economic records, and really comes to the same conclusions. For instance, they split the income and wealth brackets into a number of sort of strata and levels. I forget how many they did, but there were several levels, and concluded from the statistics that at every level, except for the very top strata, that the colonists were doing better than their counterparts in England and Europe. And the top strata would make sense because that would include like dukes and the extremely wealthy in Great Britain, who were up in the stratosphere in terms of wealth and power in the world for their day. So everything beneath that level, even rich people, just not quite that rich, on down to the very poor, what this recent study concludes is that the colonists were doing better than their European counterparts. The same study does make one conclusion that's different than what historians have generally believed, and that is that they conclude that the southern colonies were doing just as well and maybe even better economically, achieving more prosperity and higher standard of living even than the northern colonies, which is something that is a fairly new interpretation. Historians hadn't really thought that before. So we have to be careful with the conclusion here, because we're not saying, and wouldn't make sense to say, that all the colonists, everyone living in the colonies, was more prosperous by 1750 than they were, say, by 1650 or 1680, because certainly slaves were not doing better economically. Certainly, indentured servants were not doing better economically. But in general, and economic statistics, in general can be misleading. But in general, the colonies were becoming more prosperous. This brings us to this guy, Benjamin Franklin, who you've certainly heard of. You probably recognize him even without the name, just the picture itself. And at the bottom of the screen, you see a symbol of Quaker tolerance and success. Ben Franklin was born and raised in the New England colonies, but made his career and life and fame and fortune and success in Pennsylvania. So he was a beneficiary of that Quaker tendency to do things well and do things right, and he made the most of it, certainly. And I use him here partly as an embodiment, a symbol of not just Quaker tolerance, but just American colonial success, opportunity, prosperity by, say, the middle of the 18th century. Now, as an example, as far as an example goes, he's in some ways an atypical example because his success, right, is sort of beyond what anybody could reasonably hope for. So he's an extreme example of success and wealth, fame, and fortune. But nonetheless, it makes an even better example because we can remember it. So I'm saying here he's a good example of how there was opportunity to go around if you took advantage of it. It's just that he took advantage of it way more than most people would or could. But it does make the point, I think, or I'm trying to make the point, that many Americans achieved some level of success and increasing prosperity and standard of living, things we've been talking about for the last few minutes, even if they were far short of what Franklin himself achieved. I also stop on Mr. Franklin here for a moment, Dr. Franklin as he was sometimes known in his day, because we're going to be coming to grips with the founding fathers, as they're sometimes called, he being one of them. And I don't want to have to introduce them all at the same time. So, and since he's the first, the oldest of the big name founders, we'll talk about him for a few minutes here. Washington to come, Thomas Jefferson and others to follow in later units. So Franklin had a remarkable life and career. You could argue that he's the most accomplished American of all time, the most successful of ever. And he started from a humble background. This is partly why he's such a great sort of symbol of American, sort of the American success story, taking advantage of opportunity, starting with little and achieving a lot. So Franklin began as a printer's apprentice through a family connection. And if he'd gone on to just have a career as a printer, a master printer, he would have lived a comfortable life. He would have been considered middle class and a respected citizen in a town, city somewhere. But Franklin went way, way beyond that. And he seems to have realized at some point, maybe even from the beginning, that getting into the printing trade was an avenue to something even beyond. Because printing was a craft or a trade. You were an artisan or a craftsman as a printer in a way that a shoemaker would be or a barrel maker would be. But those trades didn't have the same kind of opportunity for further advancement in a career that printing did. So I don't know at what point Franklin recognized it, but he did recognize that this trade was different. Why was printing different? Because printing was connected to publishing. Publishing was connected to writing, of course, and Benjamin Franklin then took the opportunity, because the two, printing and publishing, were kind of close together, and moved from one over to the other. And so Franklin was not a printer in the end. He was a publisher, an editor, a writer, a journalist, an author, and became fabulously successful and wealthy doing so. So much so that after publishing his famous book, Poor Richard's Almanac, he retired from the publishing business as a wealthy man. But Franklin's retirement is quite misleading. We tend to think of retirement and someone retired. He retired in his 40s, so retired early. We think that people that do that today, and I think it's often true, are doing it so that they can just sort of enjoy the rest of their life and not have to work. But that's not why Franklin retired. He wanted to acquire a lot of money and retire so that he could spend his time working at things that didn't pay in the 18th century. And believe it or not, the two things that really made him famous, his business career that we've just talked about, made him successful and wealthy, but he wouldn't have made the history books if he had stopped there. But the two things that came next, his influence and work in science and his influence and work in politics didn't pay at the time. There were no university professorships of science, physics professors or chemistry professors in the 18th century, so you didn't make money at science. You didn't get paid as an elected politician or a bureaucrat in government. You didn't get paid for politics. So technically, he was an amateur scientist and an amateur politician. We oftentimes misunderstand the word amateur. It can mean the way we use it on a daily basis as he's an amateur, he's just okay at whatever he does. But more specifically and technically, amateur just means you don't get paid. So Franklin was an accomplished scientist and a brilliant politician, but he didn't get paid for either, at least not kind of in a paycheck kind of way. So he was technically an amateur. You probably heard about his or seen cartoon renditions or something of his kite flying experiments to learn about electricity, and they make it look sometimes like he was just this kind of little old man and a half crazy little old man, flying a kite in the rain just to do a little experiment out of his garage. But truth be told, Franklin did such experiments and then wrote scientific treatises that were major contributions to the world's stock of knowledge on electricity and other scientific subjects of the time. So much so that Franklin won the Copley Prize, or Copley Medal, as it was known in England, which was the highest prize in Europe for achievement in science and scientific writing. There was no Nobel Prizes in those days, but the Copley Medal was probably the closest thing to it, since it can be argued that Great Britain was the leading scientific nation of the period. So Franklin, after having already a successful career in business, and sometimes he's thought of as sort of one of the sort of great businessmen in American history, one of the earliest, but then has this second career after he's retired and can afford to dabble and spend his days studying, researching, and writing science because he's got a lot of money in the bank from his business career. That's partly why he did it, so that he could have a nest egg, not having to worry about having to make a daily living, so that he could devote himself to science, which didn't pay, and then to politics, which didn't pay. And it's his, of course, third career in politics, which overlapped with his one in science. That's what really made him famous and put him in our history book and history books. So Franklin got involved in Pennsylvania colonial politics, eventually rising to become a leader, one of the most important leaders of a particular political party, political faction in Pennsylvania politics, and eventually being appointed as that colony's representative, their ambassador, I should say, representative to Great Britain. In those days, the colonies didn't work together very much. They weren't unified. So each colony sent a separate ambassador to represent its own interests in Great Britain with the political system and the government there. So Franklin was the Pennsylvania ambassador to Britain, and he lived many years in London quite happily, partly because he was celebrated, he became famous, and he got to hobnob and hang out with and dine with and be involved in discussion groups with the top-level talent in politics and science and writing. So many of the luminaries in many different categories of politics, science, and the arts, Franklin was right there with in London, which was a vibrant urban center in those days. So a lot of talent there, and Franklin was sort of in his element. But from there, when the conflict with Great Britain, leading to the American Revolution, broke out, Franklin did come back to the colonies and got involved in anti-British activity, protesting British taxation and other laws, the ones we're going to get into in our next unit, that eventually, as I said, led to war. And so Franklin became a member of the Continental Congress, which is America's first government in fighting against the British and eventually, going to war with them. He was sent by the Congress in the middle of the war to Paris to negotiate a treaty with France, bringing France into the war against Great Britain, which he did successfully. And they sent the right guy, because as I always say, if Benjamin Franklin can't sell you something, no one can. So Franklin was a brilliant diplomat, and diplomats to some degree are salesmen. So he sold the idea of an alliance, a treaty, to the French government, and they entered the war. And we'll see when we get to the war that that alliance, some historians believe, was crucial and maybe necessary for the Americans to win the American Revolution. Franklin then, after the war, was one of the main negotiators of the treaty ending the war, signed with Great Britain, that secured American independence finally and officially. John Adams and other big names were involved too, but Franklin was one of the major negotiators there. And then came back home, and then his last major political act was one of the 55 some odd framers of the Constitution. Framers was the word for those that wrote the Constitution, since it was a collaborative project. There was no single author. Franklin was the oldest member of the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia, where he lived, in 1787. So you put that career together, and it's one of astonishing success. And here's a guy who took advantage of the opportunities that the 18th century colonies afforded him, Pennsylvania afforded him, and ran with them. So more on Franklin later on and other founding fathers, but for now, let's remember that he is an embodiment of 18th century success, prosperity, and opportunity in the American colonies. Next, we're going to look at religious developments, the rise of evangelical religion and the Great Awakening. The Great Awakening, I like to title it this and talk about it first as the rise of evangelical religion, to show how much of an influence the Great Awakening has had on subsequent American history. Since evangelical religion is still very much alive and well today, we can trace its roots back to this series of events. The Great Awakening was a flood tide of religious emotion, sort of a religious movement of great intensity. American colonists, at its height in the 1730s, but before and after that, some degree too, seemed to have a need for a renewed religious intensity, deep, intense, dramatic, spiritual, religious commitments. And that might seem strange to say, since the last time that we really talked about religion in this class, we talked about the intensity of the Puritans religiously, and a little bit even tonight, the Quakers. But truth be told, because I couldn't talk about everything, if I talked about every subject I could in this class, we'd be here for 5 years. I don't think you guys want to do that. But truth be told, between, say, roughly 1680 and 1730, about a 50-year period, religion was not on the decline, but the intensity of it had sort of leveled off a little bit. And there seems to have been a backlash against that. And in the 1730s, a need amongst many colonists who were on the way to becoming Americans, still part of the British Empire at this point, but a need for a more heartfelt, serious commitment to religion. And the Great Awakening delivered that. So the Great Awakening was kind of needed, and it came along at the right time in the right place. So what was it? I mean, how do we explain it beyond it being a religious movement that brought back religious passion and intensity? Well, I think the best way to get at this, and it is pretty complicated, is to look at sort of three religious groups and how they related with each other. what were called the Old Lights, which we can think of as the traditional Christians, traditional Christianity, the New Lights, who are the Great Awakening churches and preachers and pastors, and the Deists, who were non-traditional in their religious views and considered themselves Christian, but the other two groups that we see below them, the Old and New Lights, wouldn't and didn't see them as Christian because their religious beliefs were so non-traditional. So let's start with the group at the top, the Deists. And I start with them in part because our last bit of business and item to talk about today in this lecture is the Enlightenment, which also took place in the 18th century. And the Enlightenment really was full of deists or deists. And so then it's safe to say that the Enlightenment had an influence on the Great Awakening. That the Great Awakening, in some ways, it was a reaction to and against the Enlightenment, at least to the extent that it promoted a non-traditional approach to religion and to God. So what was deism? The fundamental tenet of deism, and I'm simplifying here, there are other tenets as well, is that deists believe that a God existed, some sort of supernatural intelligence created the earth and the universe, but that God didn't intervene in the world after that. It's sometimes, the deist God is sometimes referred to as the watchmaker or clockmaker God because it's sort of like he wound up a clock, set it down, and then walked off. So the God created everything we see before us and the incredibly complicated universe and world we live in, but didn't stick around to intervene in it later on. And if we think about that just for even a few minutes, and just take a couple of examples, we can see how radical that would be then, and would even be radical to a lot of people now. Because if that were true, and I'm not saying it is or is not true, but if the deists are right about that, then it would make things like, say, prayer pointless. The deist would be saying, well, you can pray to God if you want to, if it makes you feel better, but nothing's going to happen because there's no God there to listen. God created the universe a long time ago and then took off. He's not there any longer. It would also make miracle stories in the Bible, for instance, pointless, or at least not true, because after all, a miracle requires something supernatural to happen, which means God intervenes. So for Moses to part the Red Sea, a number, I don't know how many it would be, but lots of natural laws of nature, laws of science would have to be broken momentarily, temporarily, for that to happen, which would require divine intervention. It required a supernatural, beyond nature, supernatural act. So if the deists were correct, that there was a God that created the universe but didn't intervene, then any and all stories in the Bible that claimed some sort of supernatural divine intervention, some sort of miracle, could not be true. So, traditional Christians and the Great Awakening New Light Christians both had at least one thing in common, and that is they detested the deists and thought that they didn't believe in God, saying, well, your God is so little a God that's not even God. So they denied that the deists themselves really believed in a true God. So the Old Lights and New Lights had that in common, but they actually had a lot in common. Both the traditional Christians and the New Lights, which are the Great Awakening preachers, churches, denominations. And by the way, there were Old Lights and New Lights in really every denomination. So there were some Puritan churches that stayed Old Light, preachers that stayed Old Light, and some that went towards the Great Awakening new way of doing Christianity. And there were some Presbyterians that did the same thing. Some stayed, depending on the church, the place, the person, the people in charge of the church, the leading pastors or ministers in the church. They either preferred the traditional way of doing their particular brand of Christianity, Presbyterianism, Anglicanism, whatever it might be, or the new version. But what they had in common, other than just hating the deists, was that they both believed in more or less a literal interpretation of the Bible. They believed in regular church-going, practice. They believed in sort of a real commitment to going to church. So in those ways, they had a great deal in common. So much so, it leads us to, I think, the question, then what the heck's the difference between them? Why is there even a distinction between old lights and Great Awakening new lights? And I think the main distinction, although it might sound odd, is style. That the Great Awakening was all about doing religious services and doing preaching in a highly stylized manner and way, which sounds strange because it sounds superficial, but I don't think it is superficial when we look at it more closely. And to do that, I want to go back to the previous slide and look at this picture, which I think is a wonderful picture to explain this. So if you see the preacher there, it's not, you can't see it very well, but the preacher's waving his hands, and it appears like he's sort of shouting out and exclaiming something. And if you look at the crowd just in front of him, mostly women, but some men too, they seem to be reacting emotionally and kind of wildly, wild gesturing, and some of them are on their knees. And so it seems to be a rather intense situation. You can't know this, but it appears that there's noise, going on. The picture's drawn to try to indicate that there's kind of a lot of commotion and noise happening here. So what's supposed to be happening here? The Holy Spirit is supposed to be right there, and that's what's affecting the people, the way that they're moving and what they're doing, the way that they're reacting, the way their bodies are moving. So the preacher there probably certainly believed that the Holy Spirit was there, and he also believed that he was the one who, his own preaching brought the Holy Spirit there, and the people in the crowd, at least most of them, maybe all, also believed the Holy Spirit was there. Now, was the Holy Spirit actually present? I have no idea. I can neither prove nor disprove, and that's not my job, but nonetheless, I believe that most of the preachers of the Great Awakening believed what they were doing was bringing the Holy Spirit to these kind of church meetings, which were sometimes done outdoors, sometimes inside actual churches, and that most of the followers and churchgoers believed that was happening as well. Were there occasional phony preachers, frauds? Of course, just because there's frauds in every profession, at all times. There's always a few frauds everywhere. So yes, but I think most of them literally believe that's what they were doing. But what does this have to do with style? The point is that these preachers of the Great Awakening learned quickly that the way to get followers and the way to bring the Holy Spirit sort of to those followers, and remember, they believed that that's what they were actually doing, so it wasn't that they were trying to be phony, was to learn how to perform, to make preaching more performance-oriented, to make it more style-oriented. So there was a particular way of preaching that was practiced, and a way that was perfected, so that you were kind of working the room as the preacher. You were learning how to manipulate the crowd. That all sounds like it's negative and, again, a bad thing, but I'm not saying it in that way. You were learning how to get the crowd worked up to a fever pitch through your own skills, through your own experience, through your own ability, in order to bring the Holy Spirit down to the level of the people right in front of you. So this is highly performance-oriented preaching and church services. And the old lights hated this. They believed it was improper. They believed it was it's having to do too much that shouldn't be necessary. You shouldn't have to wave your arms around and yell and do all these sort of tricks to get people to come to church and to feel the presence of God or the Holy Spirit. They believed it should be based on sort of basic preaching and basic readings from the Bible. Again, more traditional ways of doing things. But there's also another reason they didn't like this, and that's what we could call professional jealousy. Surely they didn't like the fact that the Great Awakening was taking business away from them, and it was. So an old light preacher, say a Presbyterian church in a town somewhere in the colonies, maybe was a pillar of his community for years and decades, He packed people in on Sundays. There was standing room only in his church. And now, 20 years later, there's like 5 people there. Why? Because everyone's across town at the New Light Church, which might also be a Presbyterian church or another denomination. And so this guy is now envious and angry because he's not the big deal that he used to be. And you can see where this is going. Many of the old lights, though not all, are going to now transfer over and sort of learn the skills and try to acquire the experience to be able to do the New Light type of highly stylized, highly performance-oriented preaching, so that they can compete. And this does show us something else as well, that religions and religious denominations change. If you think your church, whether it's a Christian church or another religion or whatever denomination within Christianity it is, has never changed, you haven't studied its history. All churches change. And this is a great example of it, because one of the reasons the Great Awakening took hold and the New Lights became more popular than the Old Lights is that the new way of preaching and what they were preaching, which I haven't gotten to as much, spoke to people more in the middle of the 18th century than did the Old Lights. The Old Light, traditional Christianity, seemed to speak to people in the 1650s and 1660s, but you go 80 years in the future, and it for whatever reason isn't moving people as much. It's not inspiring them as much. So the churches have to change. The one denomination, I should say, that didn't have to make a switch, or didn't have to be split between Old Light and New Light, were the Methodists. And the Methodists, of course, are still around today. And this is only because Methodism just began right about this period. John Wesley, the founder of the Methodist Church, was running around England preaching and doing Protestant Christianity his way right around this time. So the Methodist Church began as a Great Awakening church. It didn't have to shift from Old Light to New Light. It came about during the Great Awakening. The 2 most famous preachers of the Great Awakening are Jonathan Edwards and this guy, George Whitefield. It's actually pronounced Whitfield, even though it doesn't look like it. Edwards is, I think, kind of a transitional figure. He had kind of one foot still in the sort of Old Light tradition and one foot in the New Light Great Awakening direction. So he didn't make the complete switch. Partially, you can see that, I think, through the words, or the title of his most famous sermon here, "Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God." He actually had said in that sermon, "God abhors you," talking to the crowd, saying, "God hates you." That kind of sounds like an old Puritan minister. And he did come from Puritan New England, and came from a very well-known, elite family. So I think he still was traditional, practicing traditional Christianity in some ways, but he was moving to a more emotional style of preaching. I mean, even the way he delivered these kind of sermons shows it, even if some of it is still old-fashioned. So he's transitional. George Whitefield, and I'm skipping some other famous preachers from the Great Awakening, but he was clearly the superstar, and he was for sure 100% a Great Awakening preacher. Some historians have referred to him, as you see on the screen, as America's first celebrity. There were no rock stars in those days, no professional athletes, so it makes sense that a preacher could be a big-time celebrity. And he came from England. He was never a colonist. He did whirlwind tour of the Atlantic seaboard, up and down the colonies, from town to town, city to city. And he did great advanced publicity, so people knew he was coming, and so he had sort of packed crowds waiting for him when he came to Charleston, South Carolina, or wherever it was. It's kind of like the equivalent of today, a popular band having their tickets go on sale online and selling out in 5 minutes. That was kind of the equivalent. Whitefield was extremely popular everywhere he went. And I like the painting here as well, because he was known for spellbinding sermons, kind of a high-pitched voice, and using his voice brilliantly and I think deliberately to draw in the crowd. But the painting shows him waving his hands, kind of like he's literally putting a spell on somebody. And you see the woman right below him in the front row with looking up at him, kind of like she is under a spell or about to go under a spell. So This is, of course, melodramatic, but he did apparently have this kind of effect and is known for it.